Warning, sorry about the mispronunciation in this story.
Hi everyone, welcome back to Tales of Fifi. Today I'm going to be reading a book, and the theme of the books I will be reading, that theme is animals, because you already see an adorable one right here. So right now, you probably have heard the story, so I'm going to read it to you. This story is called Puss in Boots. Retold by Vera Southgate and illustrated by Gino D'Achille. Once upon a time, there was a miller who had 3 sons. He was so poor, when he died, he left nothing but his mill, his donkey, and his cat. The mill, of course, had to be left to the eldest son. The donkey went to the second son. Then all was left for the youngest son was his father's cat. Alas, sighed the youngest son, Puss is no use to me, and I am too poor to even feed him. Do not worry, dear master, said the cat. Give me a pair of boots and a bag, and I will find that we are not as bad off as you think. The miller's son was very surprised to hear a cat talk. A cat that talks is perhaps clever enough to do as he promised, he thought to himself. So, with his last few coins, the miller's son bought Puss a pair of boots and a bag. Puss was delicate with the boots and pulled them on and strutted up and down in front of his master. He looked so proud of himself that the miller's son could not help but laugh at him. From that time onwards, the miller's son always called him Puss in Boots. Then Puss slung the bag over his shoulder and went off to the garden. There he gathered some fresh lettuce leaves, which he put in his bag. Next, Puss in Boots set off across the fields. He stopped when he came to a rabbit hole. Then, leaving the mouth of his bag, he laid quietly down nearby. A plump rabbit soon peeped out of her hole. It smelt the fresh lettuce leaves and came nearer. They were too tempting. First, the rabbit's nose went to the bag, and then its head. Puss quickly caught the strings of the rabbit, and the rabbit was caught. With the rabbit in his bag, Puss in Boots marched off to the palace and asked to see the king. When he was brought before him, he bowed low and said, Your Majesty, please accept this rabbit as a gift from my lord, the Marquis of Carabas. The king was amused by this cat wearing boots and talking. Tell your master, he said, that I accept the gift and I am obliged. On another day, Puss again lay down as if he were dead in a field. Once more, his bag opened beside him. He caught to find partridges. Again, Puss in Boots took his catch to the king. As before, the king accepted the gift from the Marquis of Carabas. He was so pleased with the partridges that he ordered the cat to be taken to the royal kitchen and be fed. As it happened, the king had a daughter who said to be the most beautiful princess in the world. One day, Puss in Boots heard the king and his daughter were going to drive along the river. Puss ran immediately to the miller's son and said, "My master, if you will do as I tell you, your future will be made." "What will I have to do?" asked the miller's son. "Come with me, master," replied Puss, and led him to the banks of the river. "There are only 2 things I want you to do," said the cat. "First, you must bathe here in the river. Secondly, you must believe that you are not yourself, but Macris of Carabas." "I've never heard of Macris of Carabas," said the miller's son, "but I will do as you say." While the miller's son was bathing in the river, the royal carriages came to sight. The king was in a carriage with his daughter beside him. His nobles were riding behind. Suddenly they were startled by, "Help, help, my lord! The Marabasque of Carabas is drowning." The king looked out of his carriage, but could see no one. But Puss in Boots, who was running up and down beside the river. However, the king told his nobles to run quickly and to help the man drowning. Puss ran to the king as soon as the nobles had dragged his master from the river. Making a low bow, he said, "Your Majesty, what shall my poor master do, for a thief has stolen his clothes?" The truth was that Puss in Boots had hidden some clothes under a large stone. "That is most unfortunate. We cannot leave him without clothes." So he ordered his servants to fetch a suit from the palace. When the miller's son was dressed in a suit of fine clothes, he looked at a very fine man indeed. The king then invited him to go for a drive with them. So the miller's son sat in the carriage beside the princess. Puss ran on quickly ahead of the carriage. She stopped where there was a meadow where the mowers were cutting the grass. Puss spoke to the mowers. "The king is coming this way, and he may ask, 'Whose meadows are this?' Unless you say it belong to Marabasque of Carabas, you shall be chopped as fine as mice meat." The mowers were simple fellows, and they were terrified to hear a cat talking in such a fierce voice. A few minutes later, the king and his nobles drove by. As the king passed the large, lovely meadow, he stopped at his carriage and spoke to the mowers. "Tell me," he asked, "who owns this fine meadow?" "It belongs to Maracas of Carabas, Your Majesty," replied the mowers. And at that, the king turned to the miller's son. You do indeed own a fine meadow, my lord," he said. Meanwhile, Puss had run further along the road. He reached a cornfield which appeared to be busy with reapers, and they were busy cutting the corn. The king soon drove by. Said Puss to the reapers, he might ask, whose cornfields are these? Unless you say it belongs to Marabasque of Carabas, you will be chopped as fine mice meat.
Reapers?
Just like the mowers, were terrified to hear a cat talking in such a fierce voice. A few minutes later, the king and his nobles came into sight. Once more, the king stopped his carriage. "Tell me," he said to the reapers, "who owns these cornfields?" "They belong to Maragass of Carabas," replied the reapers. "What a rich man he must be, and how handsome he looks," said the king to himself. "I do believe he would make a good husband for my daughter." Now the fields really belonged to an ogre, and the ogre lived in a castle a little farther along. Puss in Boots hurried along the road until he reached the castle. He knocked on the door, which was opened by the ogre himself. "Sir, I am on a journey, and as I have often heard how wonderful you are, I have taken the liberty of calling to see you." The ogre was startled to hear a cat talking, yet he was pleased to learn that the cat had heard how wonderful he was. He immediately invited Puss to the castle. "I have heard," said Puss, "that you changed yourself into an animal you choose." "That is true," replied the ogre, and instantly he changed himself into a lion. Puss got terribly frightened. He scrambled on top of a very high dresser out of harm's way. At once the ogre changed himself from a lion to an ogre again, whereupon Puss jumped down. "Sir, I must tell you that you frightened me," said Puss. "Yet it must not be too difficult for a big fellow as yourself to change into a large animal like a lion. It would even be more wonderful if a huge ogre could change himself into a tiny animal," went on Puss. "I suppose for you could not for an instant change yourself into a mouse?" "Could not?" cried the ogre. "I can change myself into anything I choose. You shall see." Immediately he became a small little gray mouse, which scampered across the floor in front of Puss in Boots. With one spring, Puss pounced upon the mouse and gobbled it up. So there was the end of the ogre. By this time, the king's carriages were arriving at the castle. Puss in Boots, hearing the carriage wheels, ran to the gate. Bowing low, he said, "Welcome, your majesty, to castle of Marabasque of Carabas." "What, my lord?" cried the king, running to the miller's son. "Does this castle also belong to you? I have nothing so grand in my whole kingdom." But the miller's son did not speak. He gave his hand to the princess and helped her from the carriage. They all entered the castle, where they found a wonderful feast ready to be served. It had been prepared for the guests whom the ogre had expected. Fortunately, the ogre's friends did not arrive. As news had reached them, the king was in the castle. The king and the princess, the nobles, and the miller's son all sat down to the feast. Puss in Boots stood by the side of his master. Every moment the king became more and more charmed with the miller's son. When the feast was over, the king said, "There is no one in the world I would rather have as my son-in-law. I now make you a prince." Then the prince said that there was no one in the world he would like for his wife as the princess. And the princess said there was no one in the world like so much for a husband as the prince. So two were married and lived in the castle ever after, in the ogre castle. Puss in Boots was very happy living in the castle. He was always the greatest favorite with the king, the prince, and the princess. Never again had Puss to hunt for a meal. He lived on the fat of the land until the end of his days. The end. I hope you enjoyed this story. Even Fifi's sleeping from it. Goodbye and thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification button, and like. Bye!